Welcome to Presbyterian World Mission's Changing Landscape of God's Mission in Mexico. My name is Rob Moore. I work in the Equipping for Mission Involvement area of Presbyterian World Mission. Today we're going to have a conversation about what it means for PCUSA's work in Mexico and their work along the U.S.-Mexico border, what this decision has meant for us, what happens to the 11 PCUSA mission co-workers currently serving in Mexico, and what does it mean for those who support them financially. What about the Presbyterian-related organizations that work in and with Mexican Presbyterian churches and partner organizations? If your church has a trip scheduled to Mexico, what should you do? How can we pray for the people in Mexico, and where do we go from here? I'd like to begin today simply by letting you know participate in this webinar most fully. We'll be taking questions using the question box within the panel at the right side of your computer screen. If you don't see a panel on the right side of your screen, look for a red arrow on a narrow strip at the top of your screen on the right. If you click that arrow, a panel will pop out from the side of the screen. You can use that arrow to open or close the panel as needed during the webinar because it will cover up some of the presentation you'll be seeing today. When the panel is open, you'll see a small white text box for questions. To ask a question, click on the box, type your question, and press Enter. You can also click a small hand icon to raise your hand and ask to be called on to ask your question on audio. So if you're joining us by phone or you have your microphone on, you can ask your questions directly to the presenter. The moderator will unmute your microphone and call on you, and you can simply ask your question to the panel. Just make sure your microphone is on and working. If you're uncertain, please use the text question feature. Feel free to type in questions for the panelists as you hear him or her speaking, and when each is done, we'll move to your questions. We may not be able to answer every single question, but we'll get to as many as we can during this webinar. One brief note about what today's webinar is and what it's not. This webinar is not a place to celebrate or condemn the actions of the presbyteries that got us to this point. It is not a place to debate ordination standards, sexual orientation, or Amendment 10A. It is a place to come together to grieve the end of a vital 139-year-old relationship, listen to the directions of several key Presbyterian mission organizations, including World Mission, and to prayerfully discern how God is calling us into mission in Mexico and the borderlands. I'd like to introduce our panelists today. First, we have Hunter Farrell, the Director of Presbyterian World Mission. We have Maria Arroyo, the Area Coordinator for Latin America and the Caribbean. We have Dave Thomas, the Regional Liaison for Mexico. Joni Lunkins, the Coordinating Team Moderator for the Yucatan Network and the Lead Instructor for Living Waters for the World. And Sarah Ott, the Convener for the Mexico Mission Network. I'd like to invite Hunter to open us up with prayer.
Thanks, Rob. Thank you all for being here this morning. It's a time of sadness, a time that calls for deep reflection and prayerful reflection. Let's pray together as we begin this time. God of life, we give you thanks for this day. We rose from sleep and you were present in the day, inviting us to be in relationship with you and with each other. We ask you now to guide our thoughts, our feelings, our reflections, that we might together shape a response that glorifies you in all things. We give you thanks for the tradition and heritage that is ours, Mexicans and Americans together, as we see the work that you have done along the U.S.-Mexican border, in Mexico, and in our own country as a result of this partnership. We ask you now to guide us as we look to you, the author and finisher of our faith. We give you thanks for each person who participates today and ask that you bind our hearts together in unity. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Hunter. At this time, I'd like to invite Dave Thomas, the regional liaison for Mexico, to speak to us about the context of this decision.
Thanks, Rob. At its meeting last year, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in July of last year approved Amendment 10A and passed that amendment on to all of the presbyteries within the PCUSA, asking them to ratify that decision, which of course all of us know changed the ordination standards within our denomination. And then a little more recently, in its meeting in May, at the meeting on Tuesday, May 10th of this year, the Presbytery Twin Cities area became the 87th presbytery to approve that amendment, which requires all ministers, elders, and deacons to joyfully submit joyfully to the Lordship of Jesus Christ in all aspects of life. The number 87 was the majority of the presbyteries that were voting, and actually the final was 97 presbyteries in favor of ratifying Amendment 10A. This passage of Amendment 10A created quite a reaction within our Mexican partner church, the National Presbyterian Church of Mexico. As a matter of fact, many of the people within that denomination in Mexico had been tracking the vote ever since the voting began. They were following it by internet. They have contacts within our country, of course, and they were keeping close track of what was happening to 10A. So early in May, a letter was sent by Hunter Farrell, Maria Arroyo, Doug Welch, to our partners around the world in anticipation that Amendment 10A was going to be ratified by our presbyteries. And so on May 6th, knowing that our Mexican partner church was very concerned about the potential passage, we could see that it was very close to passing. On May 6th, I scheduled a meeting with the elected leaders of the National Presbyterian Church in Mexico, and we talked about the ramifications. We talked about what this means. They expressed deep concern theologically. As many of you know, the Mexican Presbyterian Church has a strong tradition of conservative theology, and they were very upset about the potential that 10A might pass. So we talked, and I carried with me to that meeting a list of important points that World Mission was trying to share with all of our partners around the world. And we had a good open dialogue that day. Just a few days after that meeting, the final vote was in. We had reached 87 votes to ratify the passage of 10A, and it became part of our Book of Order. What happened next was that the Mexican church began to hear lots of rumblings about a possible break of relations. And so Maria Arroyo and Hunter Farrell and I all talked about how we might dialogue with our partners and try to stave off a break in relationships. And so we scheduled a meeting. It turns out that the General Assembly of the Mexican Church was going to have a special meeting, and it was going to be what's called a concilio, which means it was a consultation, a nationwide consultation on the ordination of women. And as many of you know, the Mexican Presbyterian Church does not ordain women as deacons, elders, nor as pastors. And so we knew that they were going to have this meeting, and we wanted to get a chance to meet with them prior to that special session. Another part of that meeting of the General Assembly was going to be a legislative session, and the legislative session was going to consider some changes to their constitution. We knew that there were some presbyteries in Mexico that had already recommended that the relationship be broken. So our idea in trying to meet with them prior to that session of the General Assembly was to dialogue with them, answer questions, address their concerns before they went into that special meeting. That meeting took place on August 16th, one day before the General Assembly met. And at that August 16th meeting, Grady Parsons, our stated clerk, Hunter Farrell, Maria Arroyo, and I were all present to meet with the 4 elected officers of the Mexican Church. This photograph on the right shows that very meeting. Hunter, Grady, Maria, and I were there. We met with the 4 elected leaders as well as the 4 ministries of the church. In Mexico, the 4 ministries are education, evangelism, resources, and relations. So all of those ministries were represented in that meeting. I have to say that the meeting was perhaps less dialogue than it was inquisition, because our Mexican partners were expressing deep concerns about our relationship and whether or not we might continue forward. At the end of that meeting, Hunter and Grady and Maria all left, and I went back home to pack to go to the next meeting, which was the very next day, August 17, and I went to the town of Xonacatlan in the state of Mexico, where I met with the General Assembly. I was there merely as an observer, and the first part of the meeting was a 2-day concilio on ordination of women. I'm sure many of you have already heard the outcome. The church voted in favor of a negative motion. The motion said, we do not wish to permit ordination of women, and it passed by 158 votes. There were about 182 people voting on that issue. So there was some strong support for women's ordination, but it did not carry. The next day, Friday, August 19th, was the day the vote was taken on whether or not to terminate the relationship with the PCUSA. It was not the first order of business. The first order of business was a judicial matter within the Mexican Church, and so they talked about that one all day long in closed session. I was not allowed to attend that part, but once they opened the doors back up, they came back in and they presented a statement. The General Assembly Directiva, which is the elected body of the elected officers of the church, they presented a statement. And in that statement, they detailed the progressive steps that had been taken. They talked about the meeting they had had with our church leaders. They talked about their reactions to the meeting, their responses to it, how they felt the answers had gone to their questions. And I must say, in that meeting that we held with them on August 16th, it was mostly the Mexican Church asking questions of us and us responding to their questions. So they reported back to the General Assembly on that meeting, and then they made a recommendation. And the Directiva's recommendation was to suspend relations with the Presbyterian Church USA, to suspend relations until their next regular GA meeting, which is coming up in July of 2012. That never got anywhere. There was a motion that was very similar to that, to merely suspend relations with PCUSA, but it did not pass. The motion that did pass was to immediately terminate the relationship with the PCUSA, to remove the paragraph from their Manual de Procedimientos, their book of order basically, to remove that paragraph that talks about our long-term partnership, and to insist that they are open to resuming a relationship with our denomination if and when we take steps backward. And what that refers to, that implies the rescinding of Amendment 10A. So that's how we got where we are. It was a very emotional meeting. The decision was made in probably less than an hour once the dialogue began. At the time the vote was taken, the General Assembly had shrunk because about 45 people had already gone home. So they were left with far fewer people to vote. Only 138 people were in the room to vote when the vote was taken to break relations. And of those 138, 116 voted in favor of the motion to sever relationships. This has brought all of us great sadness. As you've heard, we have 11 mission co-workers who've been serving in Mexico. And where we are right now, we're in a period of great sadness. I think you could say that those of you who have studied psychology know about the Kubler-Ross model of grief, and we are there. We are in the 5 stages of grief. We started off, many of us, saying, oh, nothing's going to happen to me. This can't be happening. I feel fine. And we were in denial. And right now you're seeing pictures of the 11 people who've been serving in Mexico. That's usually the first stage of grief. And then anger. You know, how could this happen? It's not fair. Whose fault is it? And then the third stage that some have gone through in this grieving process has been one of bargaining. I'll do anything if I could just stay a little longer. The stage of depression. I'm so sad. This is the rainy season here in Mexico, and so with the gray clouds and the rain falling, even as I speak here, it makes things even seem more gloomy and more melancholy. And some of us perhaps have already reached the 5th level of grief, and that is acceptance. I'll be okay, can't fight it, may as well prepare for it. But the overriding feeling that many of us have had as we have tried to deal with the situation is one of frustration and great sadness. Sadness because all of us who've been serving in Mexico have felt a distinct call from God to be here and to be doing God's work, God's mission in Mexico, together with a partner. And so it's been hurting. Of the 11 people who serve in Mexico, 6 of them have been serving as part of Presbyterian Border Ministry. Rachel Anderson, Mark Adams and Miriam Maldonado, Chris McReynolds, Andres and Gloria Garcia, and Don and Marta Waymeyer. I'm sorry, or I went past the border. Andres and Gloria Garcia. So those 6 have been serving on the border. And then further south, in the area of Las Huastecas, in the state of San Luis Potosí, Susie Frericks. And then down in Mérida, Yucatan, we've had Don and Marta Waymeyer. And they've been there for over 30 years. Many of our mission personnel are long-term, career, lifetime missionaries. And some, like my wife and me, are short-term people. We've only been serving for about 11 years in Mexico. But this raises questions for all of us. What are we going to do now? What's going to happen to Presbyterian Border Ministry? There's a lot of uncertainty. You may hear later on about the meeting coming up next week of the Presbyterian Border Ministry Executive Committee, but we just have so many questions, and Hunter alluded to some of those questions already that he's getting from people. I'm also getting calls from even Presbyterian pastors here in Mexico, from many of our Mexican brothers and sisters who are very concerned and wondering what's going to happen next. This decision by the Mexican Church has basically severed connections between synods, presbyteries, and individual churches. I know of a 4-synod partnership on the border that includes 2 synods from the U.S. and 2 synods in Mexico. And I have not talked to anybody from that particular partnership, but they must really be wondering what's going to happen with their 4-synod partnership. I also know of another synod partnership in the Yucatan between Synod of the Living Waters and the synod down there in the Yucatan Peninsula. It's affecting lots of people. And I think it's ironic to think that here's a church in Mexico that has nearly 2 million members. You know, it's almost the same size as the PCUSA. And yet 116 men voting one Friday afternoon changed things. And in spite of the fact that thousands of people on both sides of the border, thousands of people from both countries have been impacted, have been transformed by God's grace and by the work that they have been able to do jointly through this partnership that we've had with the National Presbyterian Church of Mexico. So it's it makes us very sad. In Spanish, muy triste. And we're looking forward to see what happens next. We know that God's mission in Mexico will continue, with or without the National Presbyterian Church of Mexico and its partner, the PCUSA.
Dave, thank you so much for your thoughts, and we really hear your sadness and are with you in this. I'd like to take this opportunity to move on to Maria Arroyo, the area coordinator for the Latin American and Caribbean office here in World Mission, to talk to us a little bit about their decision and our respect for it. Maria, if you'd like to jump in.
Sure. Thank you, Rob. We talked. Excuse me. We talked to the board of the National Presbyterian Church of Mexico even before we received their official letter. Their letter says that they revoked the article that entitled them to be in a covenant relation with the PCUSA and to terminate the official relations as of August 18. As General Assembly, they are open to restore the partnership and work together in the future if Amendment 10A is rescinded. They analyzed our decision on 10A, talking with their presbyteries and synods in Assembly, decided to terminate the relation immediately, denouncing the sin and explicit disobedience to the Word of God, which tells them that they should not partake in the same. That's the gist of the letter. When we talked to them, the first thing they said was that they were canceling all our work together, all joint mission immediately. We talked about each one of mission workers in Mexico. We asked for some grace so they could end their personal affairs. They also mentioned that they would rather miss relations and resources than to mix with people who don't share their views. However, after that, and we were asking questions, they said that they would continue receiving the presbyteries in partnership that voted against 10A and also were willing to sign something saying that they were against 10A and would conform to the principles of the Mexican Church.
Okay, thank you, Maria. I would like to invite the current convener of the Mexico Mission Network, Sarah Ott, to speak to us a little bit about the network's relationship to this decision. And Sarah?
Thank you, Rob. Good morning. I just want to share, I believe the statement of purpose is going to be shown on a slide that represents the work that the Mexico Mission Network does and has done for many years. As you look at this statement of purpose, you can see right away that much of it is built on a partnership with the Mexican churches that we formed relationships with. And as many of you are, we too are trying to prayerfully discern the next steps that we take as a network, as well as providing advice and support to members of our network who may be in partnership with churches. So we continue to be in a dialogue with one another within our network. Of course, our purpose is not to be conflictive with the churches in Mexico. And at this point, I think the best encouragement or advice that I can give on behalf of the Mexico Mission Network is I think communication is going to be very important with churches and individuals in the U.S. Communicating through the network what experiences they are having with the churches they have formed partnerships with. And I think that that information is going to hopefully help all of us prayerfully discern the next direction.
Thank you, Sarah, for sharing that with us. And next I'd like to invite Joni Lunkins. She was the former convener of the Mexico Mission Network and is currently working with Living Waters for the World in the Yucatan region. Joni, could you share your reflections with us?
Yes, thank you. I was asked to make some comments on the theology of all that's happening, and as I thought about that, it seems to me that there are a number of issues, questions really. We're a people of questions more than we are a people of answers, and certainly right now we have so many questions. One of them is, how can we as Christians discern the will of God, and are we truly reformed and always reforming, and how can we be continually reformed as the Holy Spirit works among us and sometimes leads us in new directions? How can we listen for that, and are we in fact willing to be always reforming? Another issue for us, and I think it's particularly relevant for us right now, and that's the question of what is the nature of the work of the church? Is the church in fact the living body of Christ? And if so, it is charged with the task of continuing the work of Christ on earth, which it seems to us was the work of reconciliation. And we're faced with a significant division here. So how do we go about the work of reconciliation between these two parts of the body? And how can we do that in ways that both respect each point of view, but also remain faithful to what we believe the church is being called to be and to do? I think those are two very big theological questions right now. It also seems to me that as ordained elders, and we of course now call ourselves ruling elders and teaching elders, but as elders, we are struggling here with two aspects, at least two, of our own ordination vows. One, how do we simultaneously preserve peace, unity, and purity of the church when sometimes those three descriptions can be in conflict with one another? And secondly, how do we uphold the policy of the PCUSA while working for reconciliation with our brothers and sisters in Mexico? Because we have vowed in our ordination vows to do both of those things. So I think those are the struggles for us right now, theologically.
Joni, thank you so much. And we look forward to your continued work. I'm going to invite Hunter Farrell to speak to us about some of our next steps, and then we'll move into a period of question and answers. Those of you who have been sending questions on your on the computer, we've been receiving those, and we're writing them down, so we'll be getting to those shortly. But in the meantime, Hunter, would you like to take it away?
Sure, Rob, thanks. I appreciate what folks have shared to this point. I think it's important, this decision on the part of our partners in Mexico comes at a time of remarkable polarization in our own church. With or without the Mexican decision, Our church is undergoing significant stress and strain from the difference of opinion, which is among our presbyteries and in many of our congregations around the passage of Amendment 10A. You all know that this is a minefield of conflict in our Christian relationships all around us, in our own families, in our congregation sessions, and in our presbyteries. And so a word needs to be said that our colleagues in Mexico, the leaders of the National Presbyterian Church of Mexico, have done their best to discern what is the mind of Christ for their church. And that's what this vote represents. As sad as it makes us, the feelings that it might generate, we have to honor their intentions of discerning and doing God's will, and that's the action that we've seen. I think we also need to be clear that we have to respect the INPM's decision because they're an autonomous church. They have the ability to discern God's will for their people together in there, what this concilio that Dave describes, which is the equivalent of a General Assembly, a specially called session of the General Assembly in Mexico. Their church was clear in the letter that they sent of their deep rejection, theologically speaking, their deep rejection of homosexuality and their concern to keep homosexuals and persons supporting gay and lesbians in ministry from connecting with their church. So there is a concern that they've expressed to us very clearly, and I think that's been spelled out both when we were there and in subsequent letters. So with that being the case, that puts us, U.S. Presbyterians, in a very awkward and perhaps an untenable situation, in that for a congregation or presbytery to continue in its relationship with a congregation or even an institution of the National Presbyterian Church of Mexico, it has to disavow a decision of our own assembly. And that, our understanding, I think Joni was alluding to this, as Reformed Christians, I know that I'm sinful enough that I'm going to get it wrong at least half the time, but we do believe that when we come together in assembly, that we together do the best job humanly possible to discern the mind of Christ. There's a full 50%, or I don't know what the percentages are, of the church that is either disagrees with Amendment 10A, or some people feel the need to leave the church to distance themselves from that situation, from that decision. At the same time, our understanding is that we together at the assembly in Minneapolis, and subsequently affirmed by the presbyteries, the majority of the presbyteries, we have discerned what God's will for us is around the issues in Amendment 10A. Whether you and I agree or not with that decision, that's how we decided as a church. So there's an awkwardness in many of us around the church, and I've talked to folks on many sides of the issue who feel an awkwardness as their churches will now have to disavow an action that we together took collectively. It wasn't a decision made by Presbyterian World Mission or by Living Waters or the Mexico Mission Network or any group of congregations, but all of us together. So there's that, what I would describe as an awkwardness, and some would describe it as an untenable situation. Perhaps the most regrettable piece in this is that the Mexican Assembly in its action reduces us and our 139-year relationship to one question, our stance on a particular issue. It's critically important, and that's not to say that theology is not important. But the result is that we are reduced to a yes or no on one particular question. And ironically, that's what our church was trying to move away from by adopting Amendment 10A, to broaden that understanding of ordained ministry. So it's deeply regrettable, unfortunate, that the situation has come to this. At the same time, our part in this, we understand from the perspective of Presbyterian World Mission, is to accept and respect the decision by the Mexican Presbyterian Church. That's why we have said publicly that we're not able to recommend to congregations and presbyteries planned short-term mission trips and collaboration, partnership with Mexican presbyteries or congregations because of this decision. That's the rationale. We're unable to do that. We recognize that many congregations and presbyteries will continue. And I wanted to share with you, I told some of the presbyteries that have been engaged in this conversation with their partners in Mexico. Several, San Diego and Presbyterio de Cristo in Arizona, are in a wait-and-see mode. They're participating in this webinar. They're trying to ask good questions and prayerfully discern where God is calling them to be in relationship with Mexican partners. The Presbytery of Southern Kansas, which has had a sister presbytery relationship with the Presbiterio de Chihuahua for many years, is now attempting to clarify with them. They're in active dialogue with their sister presbytery to understand what they're to do next. They're trying to move slowly and cautiously and in a prayerful manner. One note also from Central Florida Presbytery, we'll be considering an overture from one of their sessions at its September 13th meeting that would restore language about fidelity and chastity to the ordination standards in the Book of Order. And in the rationale, they mention that the action of the presbyteries in ratifying Amendment 10A has put a serious strain on ecumenical relationships internationally. So one of the points that we made with our colleagues in Mexico was that this debate continued in sessions and on the floors of many presbyteries and at the national level. And so we'd asked for a period of grace that we might be able to discern where we're moving in this. But that was not the decision of the Presbyterian Church in Mexico. Let me say one word, if I may, about the nature of God's call. Joni's reflections on the nature of the church. In the same way, God calls us to be engaged in mission. And as we look at the borderlands that bring our two countries together, as we look at the situation in Mexico, we recognize that there's some significant changes that are occurring to the texture of mission, both in Mexico and the United States. Because we live now in a time when there are more obese children in Mexico than malnourished children. It's a shocking statistic. And yet globalization has hit so that middle class and upper income families now are struggling more with the issue of obesity than the majority of people in Mexico who are poor or extremely poor, then they are struggling with the issue of malnourishment. Among the extremely poor of Mexico, poverty remains endemic, and much of the work of Presbyterians around this country was focused in working with the poorest 1/4 of the population in Mexico, many people along the borderlines and in southern Mexico, and Oaxaca and the Yucatan Peninsula area. The need for evangelism on both sides of the border, the need to share the good news of Jesus Christ in Mexico and in the United States among Hispanic people is extremely high, and so it really draws our attention and makes us struggle. One of the greatest laments of my heart is that we're not able to engage with the Mexican Presbyterian Church in evangelism in this country now, that this blocks our participation, our work together, at a time when we need it desperately. My own city of birth, Dallas, Texas, has moved from 12% native Spanish speakers to 42% native Spanish speakers in the last 20 years. A significant influx, and Dallas is not alone just because it's in the southwest area of the country. We see this happening even in rural cities and townships across the Midwest and northeast of the country. Likewise, the plague of violence that has been so much in the news in this country about Mexico and the borderlands, particularly Juarez and Tijuana, but stretching all across the border into Arizona and South Texas, the Rio Grande Valley. An average of 7,000 homicides a year in the last 3 years, primarily against women, particularly of Juarez. We see atrocities that are simply unspeakable. Much of that tied to the energy and money generated by the drug trade. And so however well or poorly we've done in mission in the last 139 years, may God help us to celebrate and God correct us for the things we've done wrong, and we've made more than a few mistakes. But however well or poorly we've done, if ever we needed to be engaged in mission in Mexico and the borderland, that time is now. So this place has pushed Presbyterian World Mission to begin some earnest and prayerful reflection. And we'll be inviting many of you, congregations and presbyteries, deeply concerned about what God is doing in Mexico and the borderlands, to engage in three critical global issues: that of the root causes of poverty, working in evangelism to share the good news of Jesus Christ with people who do not know Christ, and to work against issues of violence, the causes of violence that often hits the most vulnerable in a society, as is the case in Mexico. So we would invite you to join with us. Our partnership will take different forms. If a door has been shut in our participation with the INPM, we will be open to God's leading to engage with other partners, from churches to Christian nonprofit organizations to a variety of different groups of folks. And we'd invite you to walk with us in that. It will take significant coordination, it'll take significant communication, and an awful lot of prayer undergirding it. And we'll be looking to Sarah and colleagues in the Mexico Mission Network to help keep communications flowing as people begin to discern some new paths in ministry. This is what I wanted to share. I'm thankful for all of you taking time out. We want to make a special word of thanks and an apology to folks on the West Coast and the mountain areas of our country who are having to get up awful early to participate in this webinar, but it was literally the only time we could do it given the different configurations of schedules for the different participants, because we did not want to wait 2 more weeks, which would have been the next time. We felt this was an important enough conversation to bring it now. So a special word of thanks to folks who are just rising and participating in this with us. Thanks very much, Rob.
Thank you, Hunter. I want to briefly remind you how to ask questions. We've got lots of questions and a lot of hands raised, but for those of you who came in late, I just want to remind that you can click on the question area to send your question in, and we're going through those text questions. You can also click, you'll see a small hand icon below the red arrow on your GoToMeeting software. If you click that, that's indicating that you would like to be called on to ask your questions verbally. We've got a lot of questions here, so I'm going to ask our panelists to keep their answers relatively succinct so we can get through as many as possible. I'd like to start with a few questions we've gotten from earlier on in the session. This may be a looking back question, but does it touch on our future in mission? It does touch on our future in mission all over the world. Did the decision of our Mexican partners catch us by surprise? Were there any warnings? Were these warnings voiced for the whole church to hear as it was voting on the ordination standards issue? And Hunter, I think that's an appropriate question for you.
Sure. I appreciate the question. That was a question that was raised in the Minneapolis meeting in a breakout session on connecting with the global church with the Fellowship of Presbyterians that gathered there last week. There are a number of mechanisms in our church to help us listen to global partners. There are dozens of ecumenical advisory delegates and representatives that attend each assembly. We have ministry delegates. And in the last 2 assemblies, our ecumenical advisory delegates and representatives brought some concerns, one case in the 2008 assembly in both committee and on the floor of the plenary, and in the 2010 assembly in the committee meeting that was hearing about this change. The question, I think Bill Young of Presbyterian Frontier Fellowship, while raising a question about those mechanisms, he said, even with the mechanisms, he asks himself the question, would our church listen to global partners on an area as important as this? And I think that's a good question. How will we live into that understanding of the entire church around the world as part of Christ's body that Joni was alluding to? There have been warnings on the part of several of our partner churches, and that has been shared in the General Assembly process in particular when decisions were being made. I hope that responds to that particular question.
Thank you. There's another question here on the Reformed Presbyterian Church of Mexico Dave, do you know anything about what's going on there?
To tell you the truth, Rob, I've had no contact with the Reformed Presbyterian Church of Mexico. There are several Presbyterian denominations in Mexico, but because we've only been in partnership with the National Presbyterian Church of Mexico, that's really the only one that I have personally had contact with. I know that some of our individual churches from the U.S. have had contact with individual churches of that denomination, particularly in the Yucatan area, but I have not. Only our former partner, the National Presbyterian Church of Mexico.
Okay, thank you. A number of you have asked some similar questions, so I'm going to try to connect some of them together. The question has been asked by several people. Why is this particular issue so much more important than the ordination of women, and why was there not this same break in relationship when PCUSA's decision to ordain women came through? And I'll let whoever in the panel feels like answering that take a crack.
If I may, this is Dave. This is not the first time the Mexican Church has considered the issue of ordination of women. They had similar votes in, I believe, 1980 and 2006. For the Mexican Church, this is a matter of a difference between something that they describe or consider to be sin versus something they don't. As Maria explained, the Mexican Church has a view of homosexuality that leads them to consider it to be a sin, and they don't have that view toward ordination of women. It's a theological difference that they have, and we have always been respectful of the fact that they have a different viewpoint on the ordination of women. We've been respectful, even though we don't necessarily agree with them on that. And you know, I have to be honest with you. When I was sitting in their concilio, and I heard all 8 of the presentations, because the way it was organized in the concilio was 4 people spoke in favor of ordination of women and 4 spoke against, and these were theological presentations that were given. You know, I'm biased, being from the United States, being from the PCUSA, and my own personal background. I'm 65 years old, and we've been ordaining women since I was 8 years old. So to me, it's a non-issue. And as I sat in their meeting, it was hard for me to hear some of the things that I was hearing. But out of respect for their decision-making process, I didn't say anything. I didn't have the floor anyway. And our denomination has not said anything officially in response to their decision not to ordain women. But it all comes down to their theological views toward homosexuality and their theological views toward ordination.
Thank you, Dave. A number of you have asked questions about Café Justo and some of the specific programs currently running in Mexico, and have asked how this decision is going to affect their long-term and ongoing operations. Hunter, would you like to answer that?
Sure. There's vital ministry that continues to go on at many of the Presbyterian border ministry sites, and some of the programs that have been generated from those connections between U.S. and Mexican Presbyterians. There's a meeting of the Executive Committee of Presbyterian Border Ministry next week in El Paso, Texas. Several of us will be attending, Maria Arroyo and myself, along with Dave Thomas and others from our church, to be present and to work through. In a sense, this is a divorce, and we're now trying to work through how we'll continue on the vital work of ministry. We're going to be very clear and transparent with Mexican colleagues. We'll send them a link to this podcast that we're recording from this webinar, so they'll know what we're telling our churches. We want to be very clear and upfront. We're praying for the day when we will come back together as 2 partners in the body of Christ. Until that time comes, we want to continue to treat each other with deep respect. Currently, with both each of our mission workers, the Presbyterian Border Ministry sites, and the different ministries that have been generated by them are being reviewed. We're talking together to try to discern together, do mission workers or sites get redeployed into a different kind of work? How does their governance structure change, etc.? Each is a different question depending on its own bylaws and constitution, property ownership issues, etc. What we're thankful for is what we continue to understand to be the good faith of our colleagues in Mexico, who are responding to their understanding of God's call on their church. And so we honor that and respect their decision, and are struggling together to figure out how we can organize our ministry into the coming months.
Okay, we have a few questions here, again along the same lines for Maria and for Hunter. Is this action taken by the Mexican Church being considered by other General Assemblies in other Latin American countries? And that ties into a question a number of you have also been asking. Where does this relate to the reaction of congregations in other partnerships around the world? How does this fit in? Maria, would you like to talk about some of the other Latin American General Assemblies?
Sure. We have received from America and the Caribbean, and some of them were positive, some of them were negative, both affirming that we are still in partnership. Some of them said, you are going through a very hard time with this decision, and this would be the worst time for us to break relations. So we won't do that. We continue with you in prayer. So there are a variety of responses. However, I think that possibly in the next year, some of the churches will consider this in their general assemblies. But it is unknown now.
Help me, I'm sorry, Maria. Well, they'll be considering what question at their general assemblies this next year?
They will be considering if they want to break relations because of Amendment 10A.
Okay, thank you.
A number of questions have come up asking whether or not this reaction has caused World Mission to reevaluate any of its stances on partnership, which I thought was an interesting question. Hunter, would you offer some comment?
Yeah, that's a great question, and profoundly missiological, and I appreciate the question. As you all know, or as you may know, in our long history of mission, nearly 174 years of mission as the General Assembly of our church, we have only suffered 2 breaks in relationships, and those were both related to the end of the colonial era and a need for churches to stand on their own 2 feet. So the Presbyterian Church of East Africa in Kenya and the National Presbyterian Church of Mexico, both at different times in the 70s and 80s, asked for a time apart where our mission workers, short-term mission trips, and the waves of Presbyterians that were visiting their shores would not come for a time, so there could be a chance for those churches to take some steps into self-support and self-governance and be able to stand on their own 2 feet. That was part of the moratorium movement that was trumpeted in the late 60s, early 70s, part of that. And those were the 2 cases in our own situation, both the Mexican moratorium lasting about 7 years and the PCEA moratorium lasting a few more than that. But this is the first time that a church has broken relations with us for good, in a sense, until a change would be made in our own Book of Order rescinding 10A. What this does is it pushes us to take another step in our understanding of partnership. A key change in World Mission in the last 2 years, we recognize that we in World Mission were not in a good partnership with our own congregations. And so we've been taking some specific steps And if you've got an hour, I can walk through those with you, but a number of things we've been doing to reawaken that relationship between congregations and our mission workers and the work that we do around the world. But particularly in this case, we do sense a clear call of God to continue to be engaged in Mexico. With the shutting of the IMPM door, we will be engaging still in partnership, but with other Mexican Christians. And so that's the direction we sense clearly God is calling us. We want to do so in a way that does not break unity of the National Presbyterian Church of Mexico, that does not disrespect the church, its assembly, or its leadership. We want to do so with transparency, openness, and continuing consultation. And we're willing to get as close to them as they're willing to receive us in that spirit of consultation and coordination. So that's where we are now in this particular situation.
Thank you, Hunter. Sarah and Joni, we've had a number of questions asking for additional contact information for the Mexico Mission Network. So I was wondering if you could let folks know how it's best to get in touch with you for projects they have.
We have a site through the Mission Crossroads that is probably the best way to sign up for. If they go to, I think it's missioncrossroads.org, and then search for Mexico Mission Network, they can join and become a member there. We are currently also working on getting a Facebook site as well. So those will be two places. Immediately to get contact would be the either to go through missioncrossroads.org, and hopefully soon we'll have the Facebook site up as well.
Thank you. Joni, we have a number of questions about specific Living Waters projects. Do you have any information about the status or the impact of this decision on pending projects or things that have already been funded or planned?
Yes. As they know, the Synod of Living Waters has a covenant relationship with the Synod of the Peninsula, and Living Waters for the World operates in the Yucatan Peninsula under that covenant, so that our systems there are in Presbyterian churches. Our water systems are in Presbyterian churches in the Yucatan Peninsula. They have contacted us. We have asked them what do they see in the future, and they have responded by asking us where we stand on the amendment. We have not yet replied to that. But we have been in conversation, the leadership of Living Waters has been in conversation about how to reply. It is our hope that somehow we can continue in relationship, but I suspect that churches and presbyteries who are going to be asked to disavow the action of the General Assembly will not be willing to do so. Living Waters is in a position to disavow that action either. So it's very much up in the air right now. I hope that we will be visiting with the Directiva of the Synod within the next month. If we cannot come to some understanding of a way we can continue, I'm hoping that at least they will permit an exit strategy so that our partnerships can gracefully and with love remove themselves from the partnership, at least for the time being.
Okay, thank you, Joni. We've got a couple of really good questions here about support, contributions from congregations that they're currently making to border ministries, Proyecto Amistad, and others. One question in particular from John Hathaway asks, should we continue to support as normal, or should we wait until the terms of the divorce are negotiated? Maria, do you have an answer for that?
We have a meeting with the Directiva of Mexico on the executive committee of Presbyterian Border Ministries, and the Mexicans said that they are coming to see how we phase out this, at least what we do together in the ministries. So we don't know the shape they're going to take, and it would be better to wait and see if to collaborate with each of the ministries, because they might change, they might cease to exist, some of them. So it would be wise to wait on those.
Okay. So people should continue to give?
I think they should continue to give. We won't stop working with Mexicans. But it would be wise to wait and not send, for example, to Proyecto Amistad, because we don't know if that will continue as it is.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question here that is related for the whole panel. It asks, painful as this development surely is it not our role to ask them to consider the witness that our people seem to be making that God is doing something that we have not recognized? How are we approaching making this witness? And I'll open that up to the panel.
Well, fools rush inward.
This is Maria, and I will just make a short comment. During all these times of partnership with the Mexican Church, we have always talked openly about these difficult things that separate us theologically. And we have always listened to each other with care. Since the time when we started the discussion of ordaining gay people, we were talking with the Mexican Church, and we were trying to tell them why this was discussed, and just respecting the Presbyterian ways and our Reformed tradition. Not trying to convince them, but explaining to them where we were. And this is the same that we did this time. Now, since this discussion started, we talked to the Mexican Church, and we heard from them several times that since we have had difficult times and differences through the years, they wouldn't break relations with us. The past board, two past boards of the Mexican Church said that to us. But I think at this time there are some people in the board of the National Church that are just not able to listen to this. This is just too much of a break in their understanding of the word.
Okay, thank you, Maria. We've got a number of questions here asking about work with other denominations, both within the U.S. and in Mexico. Are there current plans for other partnerships, replacements, or looking to other ecumenical bodies that are more in line with our own theology?
This is Maria. I have a comment. During the moratorium, the past moratorium, we were working with some other partners in Mexico. It was more on theological education, but also social outreach, and I think we will continue trying to strengthen those relations. There are also some ecumenical relations that were formed in the border, for example, with the Ministry of Frontera de Cristo. That ministry has ties and works in collaboration with many other churches, even the Catholic Church along the border, or Café Justo, that goes from the border all the way to Chiapas. So we will continue seeing in what way we can continue some of those very good ministries and have new ones.
I think at this point, premature of a actively seek partner in Mexico. as Maria explained, we have ongoing relations that are not formal partnerships in many places throughout Mexico. And Maria mentioned Frontera de Cristo, where there are multiple relationships and partnerships there, and there are others throughout the country, but they are not presently in the same form as the partnership we had with the Mexican Presbyterian Church. And I just think it would be really premature of us to think about, you know, we just came from a divorce. Is it time for us to go find a new partner right away?
That's helpful, Dave. And I think the language of then, we wouldn't use the term replacement by any means. Rather, we continue to have a relationship, broken as it is, with the National Presbyterian Church of Mexico, and we're praying for the day when we can come back together and join in mission. And until that time, we will be moving forward to respond to God's call in mission, and that may bring us into relationship with others in Mexico and on the borderlands. So I appreciate that word, Dave.
Okay, we've got a few hands raised on audio, so if you've got your hands raised, I'll begin with William Voigt. William, go ahead. William, are you with us? Okay. Chris Edscorn. Chris, you can go ahead and ask your question. Chris? Okay, we'll go back to some of our text questions. A number of questions have come in asking both about how this is affecting Mexican Presbyterians in the U.S., both in terms of the work they're doing and then delegations from the Mexican Presbyterian Church doing work with the border on our side. Maria, how is this affecting Mexican Presbyterians working in the U.S.?
Well, Mexican Presbyterians in the U.S. have already been recognized and are members of a presbytery in the U.S. So they are struggling with a lot of sadness, but most of them, I think, will continue in the ministry they had. Work in the border has been slowed down because of violence, so there are not many groups going to the border, and there was not a lot of work in this side of the border. So that's not being affected at this point.
Okay, thank you. Tracy King Ortega asks, when the decision was made, was there any discussion amongst the Mexicans as to how this would impact existing partnerships? And Dave, that sounds like a question for you.
There was a lot of discussion during the meeting when the vote was being taken. I was the only PCUSA representative present at the meeting, and it was an emotional meeting. There were viewpoints presented against the idea of breaking relations, and some of those people who spoke against the motion to break off relations, some of those people did express concern about how that vote would impact their own partnerships. Yes, definitely. To answer your question, Tracy, there was a viewpoint presented like that, but the meeting was very emotional, and there really wasn't much reaction to that. I believe that a lot of the voting delegates came to the meeting with their mind already made up. Many of the presbyteries and synods in Mexico had already had meetings to discuss this idea of breaking relations with the PCUSA, and so there wasn't much anybody could have done to change their minds, because many of them came with their minds made up.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Keeping on the vein of questions from mission coworkers, we've got a question from Mark Adams. Hunter, would you agree that just as U.S. churches may have to disavow a GA's decision, the same situation exists for churches and presbyteries in Mexico. They are put in the place of, are they put in the place of disavowing their GA's decision or disavowing a relationship or partnership?
Yes, Mark, thanks for the question. It's clearly a mutual relationship, and because the door has been closed by the National Presbyterian Church of Mexico, that places their congregations and presbyteries and institutions in a difficult and perhaps an untenable position, a language that I use for our situation, in that it places a presbytery that wants to be faithful to what they've understood to be God's call in mission, which relates to a U.S. presbytery, say the Presbyterio de Cristo in the Arizona area. Presbyterio de Cristo voted in favor of 10A, and therefore presbyteries would not be able to, according to the decision of the INPM, relate to Presbyterio de Cristo. And yet there may be presbyteries on the Mexican side that want to continue to do that. So they're going to be in conversation with national leadership and the directiva, as they call it, and with their assembly and the next year's assembly to discuss this. I would imagine it would come up for discussion because of that pressure.
Thank you, Hunter. As we come close to our closing time, I want to remind all of you that this the recording of this webinar will be available on the Mexico page of the Presbyterian website, and it will go up later on today. We're going to have some time for about 3 more questions. And I know there are a lot of you who've asked questions, and I'm looking at a screen of 30 or 40 or so we're sifting through them. I'm going to be sharing all of your questions with all of the panelists, and hopefully some of them can be addressed at the next webinar, which we'll be holding in Spanish in a few weeks. The content will be the same as today's webinar, but it will include those in the church whose primary language is Spanish. Hunter, I've had a number of questions here for you asking what is a concise message that we can give to our congregations, our mission committees? What's a concise message to take away from this in terms of how to summarize the situation?
Yeah, good question, and I wish it were that easy. I think it's really important that I understand the folks that are gathered around this telephone call and this webinar to be leaders in congregations and presbyteries. I think this is a very important and a very nuanced conversation. So I would hope that folks would share some of the nuance of it, because particularly in a polarized church environment like we have, with or without the Mexican decision, in this very polarized environment, that's when messages get reduced to incendiary statements about cutting off relationships and not having to do with and rejection, etc. I would hope that the folks participating in this webinar would be faithful bearers of some of the texture of this conversation, the theological struggle that the church are having now in their desire to be faithful to God's call to mission in Mexico. The question, and if I can attempt to read the mind of the question maker, is the specific of to do in the case of a trip or a relationship, a partnership. What the Mexican church is saying to us is they are reframing our partnership around one particular issue. Many of our congregations and presbyteries will not be able to participate with a clear conscience in mission if it's reduced to that one criterion. That places them in a very difficult position. And likewise, as Mark Adams mentioned through his question, it places the Mexican partners in an awkward situation with their own assembly, which has more of a more direct power in their lives than, say, the U.S. assembly would be. We work more as a network of congregations. I think the bottom line for us is the reason that Presbyterian World Mission and what I'm hearing from Living Waters and perhaps others in our church simply not able to move forward in as usual mode. This calls for some prayerful reflection. It calls for some intense conversations with partners on the Mexican side, and a time of discernment for all of us how we're going to proceed forward. For Presbyterian World Mission, our mission workers, and many of our presbyteries and congregations, there is a sense that we need to continue to be engaged in Mexico. So we understand that the form of that connection will be changing as a result of the Mexican decision. Thanks.
Okay, we've got a number of you getting in some of these last-minute questions. One question that we've gotten, were the voices of any youth or young adults from the Mexican Presbyterian Church heard during this special assembly? And Dave, since you were there, were any of those voices heard?
In the Mexican Presbyterian Church, the only people who go as voting delegates are ordained pastors and elders, and there are very few elders present. There were no youth represented in the vote, and there were definitely no women represented in the vote. It was 116 men who voted to terminate the relationship. I didn't even see any youth in the meeting, except those who were serving meals.
Okay. Does anyone have particular insight into the direction that the Mexican Presbyterian Church is giving to its own churches, how they're speaking to their churches, and what the instructions are for those pastors and existing partnerships?
This is Maria. What they told us is that they were going to communicate with all of the presbyteries and churches to not be in partnership unless it was with a presbytery who voted no on 10A and signed something saying that they were against ordination of gays, something like that.
Okay.
But just an aside comment, many people that we have met in Mexico that David has talked with don't know anything about this, not even about the breaking in relations. So that communication is going to take time.
Okay, thank you, Maria. I'm going to give our last question to the entire panel, and then we'll be coming to a close. The last question, and a number of you have asked this question, is what is the impact on our mission coworkers, both in the immediate future and in the long term? What impact do we see for those coworkers? And I'll open that up to the panel.
Dave, maybe you can respond, and I know you can't give the personal details as you have been in consultation with different ones of the mission workers in terms of their own employment plans, et cetera, but in a general sense, it might be helpful to share.
I heard the question, Hunter, in terms of all of our mission personnel, not just the ones in Mexico. Did I misunderstand that, or?
Most of the questions have been aimed towards the mission personnel in Mexico, the 11 that were spoken about earlier.
Okay. You know, each case is going to be considered on an individual basis. I couldn't answer that on a, give you a blanket statement about the impact on our mission personnel. I know that each of us is going through our own range of emotions. Each of us is dealing with the various steps of grief that we're going through, and I wouldn't want to comment on individual cases, but on the whole, there's a lot of concern, still many questions. A lot of the questions that have been raised in this webinar are the same questions that our mission personnel have been asking. And unfortunately, neither Hunter, nor Maria, nor I, nor really anybody else has all the answers to respond to their questions. And so it's frustrating when you're in that position and not being able to answer the questions of many of our people. I think that all of our mission personnel have been in prayer about this. This is the time to really reconsider what our calling is and think about what God might be calling us to do next. I think many of us are thinking about next steps.
This is Maria. Let me just say that from the Presbyterian point of view, we have already a call with them. We will call them together someplace soon so we can talk about this ministry and thank God for the unity all of these years. All of them are under appointment, and this appointment is going to be considered for each one of them. Some of them might look for a reassignment in another place, in another ministry. Some of them are leaving service, and that was already in the plans. But all of them are being taken care of. We are working and praying with them.
Okay, thank you, Maria. I want to thank all of you for coming to participate in this webinar. There were many good questions that we weren't able to get to, and I want to say again that I'm saving all of your questions and I'm going to be sending them on to the panel. But your participation has been invaluable, and we look forward to continuing to share with you about the decision and the consequences of this decision. On your screen right now, you can see peaceusa.org/Mexico. As we have new news and new information, that's where we'll be putting it. The recording of this webinar today will be going up on that page, and as well as a place for discussion and comments. We hope to see you for our next webinar, which will be in Spanish, and we'll be announcing that on the Mexico page fairly shortly. If you have interest in some of the critical global issues going on in Mexico, there's an email address for Hunter up on the screen, so you can send some of your questions to him about the critical global issues in Mexico. I'd like to thank our panel, Joni, Sarah, Hunter, Maria, and Dave, for your excellent information and answers to questions. And I want to thank all of you for attending. Blessings on all of you in your ministries, and we look forward to continuing to work with you.